beat Tottenham 3-1. Dismantled them, some would say. If you've ever found Christianity irresistible, then this video is for you. Of the people that I talk to who share their reasons why they resist Christianity, I'm actually surprised that none of the reasons actually directly relate to Christianity. Which to me is really interesting, because in the first century when Jesus walked the earth, people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, and he liked them back. So in this video, we're going to discover, hey, what happened that made Christianity so resistible, and can it become irresistible again? And we're going to go for a walk as we talk about this. Saws. If you're new here on the channel, my name is Chris, and some of the reasons I've heard that people resist Christianity are things like, well, there's contradictions in the Bible. They think that at the center of Christianity is a book that doesn't contradict itself. It's not. Some other reasons I've heard are, well, pain and suffering disprove the existence of God. That's not true. The only thing that pain and suffering disprove is the existence of a God that doesn't allow pain and suffering. And that's not the God of Christianity. In fact, the God of Christianity said there would be pain and there would be suffering. Another reason that I've heard that people resist Christianity is their bad church experience. I've had a bad church experience. In fact, I've probably created bad church experiences for other people. But none of those things are central to the message of Jesus. In fact, if you were to transport back to the first century and you were to talk to people and you were to say, hey, why do you resist Jesus? There's only one reason that they would resist: Jesus' claims. Religious leaders didn't really have an issue with Jesus' character. Nobody accused Jesus of being dishonest or immoral or cruel. The one thing that kind of got under their skin really was his popularity. As Jesus' popularity grew, their popularity decreased. And this wasn't just Jewish religious leaders. Jesus came to be the fulfillment of Judaism and the replacement of paganism. Jesus came to introduce a new movement, a new model, and a new ethic. Jesus said to the Jews, hey, this system you have of bringing a sacrifice to God, I'm going to fulfill that so that you don't have to do that anymore. And to the pagans, and if you're wondering what is a pagan, it was effectively anyone that wasn't Jewish. Nike is the goddess of victory in paganism. And to the pagans, Jesus said, hey, I'm going to do away with all these created gods that you begin to worship. You don't need them anymore. Which sort of leads us to the question, how did something like that become so resistible 2,000 years later? And I'm convinced that the new movement, the new ethic that Jesus introduced into the world gets made unnecessarily resistible when we mix something old back in with it. But to understand the new that Jesus brought into the world, we need to understand what the old was to begin with. And in order to do that, I want to introduce you to a specific group of people. Ancient Israel. And what you need to know about ancient Israel is they were a means to an end, which is really a fancy way of saying they had a purpose. And more specifically, they were a means to a divine end. Right from the beginning, God had a purpose or a goal for the nation of Israel. And he outlines this goal. And we discover that purpose around 2,000 years before Jesus shows up on the scene, when God makes a promise to a 99-year-old guy called Abraham. And the promise is that God is going to bless him and make him a great nation. Now, we can't even begin to imagine just how ridiculous that promise would have looked to a 99-year-old guy in the middle of nowhere with no one around him. God said, hey, I'm going to do something and I'm going to bless you. Well, first of all, ancient nations didn't even bless other nations. That wasn't even really on the radar. In fact, modern nations don't even bless others. We spy, we interrogate, we impose sanctions on others, but it's not really a thing that we bless other nations, even today. That promise unleashed a sequence of events. And eventually Abraham got some people, and they moved to Egypt, and they multiplied big enough to become nation status. And that actually made their host nation, Egypt, very uncomfortable. And rather than kicking them out, the Pharaoh of Egypt decided to imprison them. And they were slaves for 430 years. And at that point in time, God shows up. And Abraham's long gone, but God taps Moses on the shoulder and he says, hey, I want you to rescue my people from slavery. And an incredible series of events takes place that we don't have time to cover in this video. You should read it for yourself. But effectively, God rescues the nation of Israel from the Egyptians. 4 months after they escape from slavery, Israel is camping at the bottom of a mountain. And Moses goes up the top of this mountain and he returns with the 10 Commandments. Now you may have some idea, or maybe you've heard of the 10 Commandments, but you might not be familiar with the whole story. And that's where my friend here is going to fill you in. While you may be familiar with the 10 Commandments, perhaps you're not familiar with the exact way they're structured. See, they're actually a legal treaty with what's known as the Suzerain Treaty. Now, a Suzerain Treaty is any kind of treaty that's formed between two groups of people that are not of equal standing. In this kind of treaty, the suzerain dictates the terms to the lesser party. In other words, in this term, God said, if you will follow these commands, I will keep you safe. If you will obey, I will protect you. Effectively, what it led to was saying if the nation of Israel didn't keep the commands that God had issued, then he was under no obligation to help them at all. Back to the story. Right, thanks for that. When God set up the nation of Israel, he always intended for himself to be their king. But as the nation of Israel grew and it looked around, it wanted to be like one of the cool kids. And it realized that in order to kind of get the blue verification tick of a nation, it needed a king. And so the leaders of the nation of Israel went to the prophet Samuel. And they said to Samuel, hey, can you kind of talk to God and see if we can get a king in place? And originally the conversation didn't go to plan, but eventually God relented and Israel got a king. Now, if the nation of Israel had never wanted a king, the story would be completely different. There would be no David and Goliath. There would be no book of Proverbs or Psalms because Solomon wouldn't have existed. But there would also be something else that's missing from the story, the temple. You see, in order to be a blue tick nation in the people of Israel's minds, they needed a temple because every other nation had a temple. And up until that point, the presence of God had lived in a tent within the nation. And that's super weird, I get that. But the best way I think I can explain it is, you know when certain people walk into a room and you can feel their presence? It wasn't as if God was physically in a body living in a tent, but his presence was. He was with the nation and they could feel his presence with them. And eventually, after King David maps all the plans out for this temple and his son Solomon builds the temple. And it's kind of really set up as the golden era of the nation of Israel. There's no fighting, there's finally a temple. And everyone's like, finally, God's gonna bless the nations through us. But Solomon done messes up. Okay, Solomon goes and starts building all these other small temples. Why? Because Solomon went and married a bunch of women who weren't Israelites. And when he married them, he started worshiping their gods as well. So now there was this big temple to the God of Israel, and there was also all these little temples around to gods of Solomon's wives. This led to a downward spiral in the nation of Israel. And in about 700 BC, the nation actually split in half. The northern kingdom completely abandoned God, and the southern kingdom wasn't far behind. At this point, to imagine that the nation of Israel could bless anyone was ludicrous. God had left the temple and seemingly left the nation of Israel to its own devices. And then if that wasn't enough, in 587 BC, after a bloody siege, King Nebuchadnezzar takes control of the nation of Israel and tears Solomon's temple to the ground. Then in 538 BC, the Persians invade the Babylonians, and finally the nation of Israel are allowed to return to their home turf. And they're allowed to rebuild the temple, a much smaller version of the temple. God didn't return to the temple. Remember, the temple was never God's idea to begin with. But the nation of Israel kind of thought to themselves, maybe now that we've got a temple back, God will return and bless the nations through us. But not too long after this scaled down temple was finished construction, things spiraled again. The economy started to spiral, the nation began to rip apart, and every time they looked at the temple, they were just reminded of the broken heart that they were left with. And into this world stepped the prophet Malachi. Malachi stands as the final chapter to what we now know as the Old Testament. And into a world full of despair, a nation that had lost all hope, Malachi says, hey, God's got a message for you, and it's this: my name will be great among the nations. And then later on he says, look, I am sending my messenger and he will prepare the way before me. And then after they're given that glimmer of hope, silence. There were no more prophets. The nation of Israel and Judea remained under foreign control. And at the height, or the moment in history where the Roman Republic turns into the Roman Empire, God begins to do something. And he does something in the most strangest way, where a carpenter discovers that his fiancée was pregnant. And while trying to decide what to do about that, an angel spoke to them in a dream and said, "It's Joseph, son of David. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you will give him the name Jesus, because he will save the people from their sins." All of this occurred to fulfill the Lord's message through his prophet. "Look, the virgin will conceive and give a child. She will give birth, and they will call him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. In other words, the wait for God to do something is over. And God would return to the temple one last time, but not as a presence, not as a spirit, not as a cloud, as a Galilean day laborer. A day laborer who would later become a rabbi. And that rabbi named Jesus would start a fire that neither the temple nor the empire could control, and a fire that would eventually usher in something brand new. And we're going to continue the conversation in our next video. Hey, thanks for watching. There are new videos every single week here on the channel, so when you hit subscribe, you are sure to never miss a video. Ooh.